Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Basic Income by Philippe Van Parijs and Yannick. I believe his last name is pronounced Vanderborght. And if I mispronounce either of those names, I do apologize. Um, I'll talk about what the book is, talk about the authors a little bit first, and give an overview of what the book is. Talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Philippe Van Parijs and Yannick Vanderborght. Philippe is a famous economist and philosopher. Yannick is a little bit younger, and he is a professor of political science. Philippe has written books on basic income for a very long time. It's kind of the idea that he's most associated with. And to kind of just give an overview of terms, has been called many, many different things with kind of various degrees of small differences. In this book, what they're calling for is a universal basic income, meaning it's an income that is paid by somebody, usually a nation state, to all of the people who are citizens of that nation state, or even beyond citizens, without strings attached. Um, Usually monthly, could be yearly, but usually monthly. So it's universal in that everyone gets it, and it's basic because it's not usually an amount of money that is supposed to replace an income. Um, but that's what they're calling for, universal basic income. And um, it's an idea that has had a long, long, long history. And what this book does is it goes over the history of the idea, a defense of the idea, objections to the idea, the response to those objections by the authors, and tries to situate the idea of a universal basic income in a distributive justice model, how it can fit into that. And then the book ends by asking if it can be a uh, beyond the nation state, if it can go a universal global income, essentially, for all citizens, all peoples of the world. So it's a very ambitious book. There's a lot to cover. It goes into uh, different groups and how different political groups, union members, uh, liberals, conservatives, Greens, have responded to the idea of a universal basic income over the years. Um, a lot of the book is a history of that idea, and where the idea has risen, and the history of the political struggle to get that passed, and largely the failure to get it passed. So that's a large portion of the book. I did like that they were serious about objections to it. They go into different funding sources for universal basic income. One of them, an example being Alaska's model. If you're not aware, Alaska pays $2,000 roughly each year. It depends on the amount of oil they sell. But there's a sovereign wealth fund in Alaska where all the residents of Alaska, after I think they have to prove their residency for a year, receive a check from the state of Alaska for roughly $2,000 that they can spend on whatever they want. A universal basic income that they're talking about, that the authors are arguing for in this book, the amount that they argue for is roughly 25% of GDP. To give you some context, that would be $2,000 per person in the United States. So it was a very philosophically interesting book, because a lot of times you'll read things and the authors of whatever you're reading don't take the idea seriously enough to wrestle with objections to it. And they do that mostly at the front of the book, and by a few pages in, really, they assume that you're on board, and they come back to really most of the idea is the book is the struggle, the idea, where the ideas come from, the history of the idea, the iterations of the idea. They go through some alternatives to universal basic income, like a earned income tax credit, or a negative income tax, or a universal jobs program. Um, so I like the thoroughness of the book. It seems like a lot more than it is, because there's a ton of footnotes. They do clearly have done their homework in terms of references to other works. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other books that are referenced in this, other works that are referenced in this. Um, I appreciated the thoroughness. Um, I think that I appreciated them talking about alternatives as well and responding why they think a universal basic income is the best for what they are trying to achieve. What they are trying to achieve really is trying to maximize people's freedom. Um, Van Parijs uh, wrote a book in 1995 that's called Real Freedom for All and has a picture of a surfer on the cover. And so they come back again and again to this idea of someone who's a surfer. Like, would you, if you lived in a society and you worked and you knew that there was someone who was surfing instead of working, would you be comfortable with that person making $2,000 a month to go surfing? And Van Parijs in Vanderbilt basically acknowledged that there are people who are going to be very upset about this and who will not accept this. And they show how that differs country to country. It's much more of an idea that's accepted in Europe, perhaps unsurprisingly that it is in the United States. Though probably the closest thing to a successful model is probably the Alaskan model, really, around the world. They look into areas in Africa that have tried this with a little bit smaller amounts of money. They go through the likely economic ramifications of the idea. There are some jobs that are going to require the floor to be raised. One of the things, the constant analogies they use this idea of a floor to stand on. So if you think about people who would really benefit from this, they have a whole section of a chapter dedicated to how women especially would really benefit from this. They aren't paid now. Many disproportionate number of caregivers right now are women who are unpaid. This would be an acknowledgement of that labor, and also the ability for women, if they are in situations where they are in toxic relationships and their income is tied to a breadwinner, this allows them to get out of a situation that may be bad for them. So I like that. The whole book is a lot of ideas of that nature, and that's the whole book. It's just the idea and the ramifications of it. Some of the things that I think were a little bit harder and I think were a little bit frustrating. It's not really the book that I wanted. It is very dry and very academic, and a lot of it feels, especially towards the end, where you would get into the deep 500-year history and then the even deeper 100-year history of the political movements in all these different European countries. The two authors are they're both European, and the book has a Eurocentric view to it. But that felt at times where it was a little bit of a grind. So that was a bit much. I guess what I was looking for was like more of a question and answer type of thing where you would ask, like, what is universal basic income? Why this model? Why is this particular model that you're recommending the model to use? And they answer all those things, but it's really kind of spread out through the book, and you really have to work for some of those answers, especially the terms of funding. I think they don't have a one-size-fits-all model for the funding. And they basically say, we probably think it should be done through the income tax, which would really require a huge increase in income tax. In Europe, towards the end of the book, they mention a value-added tax, which is common in Europe, and they call for and point out the European Union probably being the area where this is most likely politically to happen, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I really... like I said, some of the areas were grind. I don't know if I needed 6 pages on why the Green Party would or would not support a UBI. So some of it was a little bit much. Some of the level of detail of the stuff I thought made it a much harder book and less accessible to the average audience than maybe it could have been. I do, like I said, I appreciated the bringing in the political objections that you're going to have, because I think at least that keeps the book intellectually honest. I don't know if it does a lot to get over it. At the end, they basically say, you're probably going to have some kind of work requirement, at least at first, to get this idea off the ground. So it makes it kind of similar to the earned income tax credit, at least at first, and maybe over time you can, get rid of maybe the work requirement. Though to me, like the idea too, if you married this to something like a national service program and said, if you if you engage in a national service program for a year or two, and then that enables you to receive a universal basic income, that would be also a way to ease society into the idea a little bit easier. Um, they're agnostic to how the thing is funded. They say, different countries are going to fund it different ways. Some will fund it through income tax. Some will fund it through wealth funds related to natural resources. They point to the possibility of using carbon taxes as a way to fund it. So I thought all those were interesting. They kind of obviously go over like a lot of the pros that I said of the idea, why they think it's a good idea. Um, yeah, I don't know if you needed the history of welfare type systems from 1500 onwards. I think that stuff could have been condensed, and the book could have been shortened quite a bit. The one part of it that I would say I was angry about, I wouldn't say angry. Angry may be a little too strong, but they go into alternatives to the universal basic income, and one of the alternatives that they raise is a guaranteed jobs program. So instead of the state guaranteeing you an income, they would guarantee you a job. And so at one point they say, this is if you remove people who are the highest skilled people, excuse me, at this point, if you remove those people because they're the ones most likely to be able to get back into the workforce the fastest, the cost benefit analysis would come out something close to prisons, which is to say, you basically would be paying people money to not produce very much. And you sit there and you go, well, you have at least in the United States, millions of units of housing that needed to be built. There's solar panels to be installed. There's ultra reflective paint to paint government buildings. There's trees to be planted. There's places where you could use additional teachers. And so it was a little bit of a stretch to me, at least, to fully embrace that idea. I thought that was kind of something they threw out without a lot of context. And and then they talk about the part of the book that I had to put the book away because I was like, maybe I'm just misinterpreting this, but I think I'm interpreting this correctly. So this is again still in the section where they talk about the guaranteed employment. And they're talking about the guaranteed employment and why the idea for guaranteed employment is worse than an idea for a guaranteed basic income. And they say that there are people, they basically say, we acknowledge that there are things that workers gain in non-material goods that are valuable to society. So this would be things like dignity through your work, a feeling of accomplishment, a feeling of being with something that's part of something that's greater than yourself, a sense of community. Now, obviously, those things are all very person to person of how much they value that. But I think most people argue, and I think even they acknowledge, there's some amount of that is done. And they say, a guaranteed job, a guaranteed employment system would not grant those to some people. And I said to myself, is searching for a job and receiving a job really that vital to those feelings? And I thought that was kind of a silly idea because what you're basically saying is, for the millions of people who can't find work right now, and they say this, they use this language in the book. They say those people have skills that society does not want. And I was like, well, there are cyclical natures to almost all employment markets, and sometimes you have skills that are really high demand, and sometimes they're not in high demand. But it's not necessarily that the skills you have is not what society wants. It could be that you're just an unlucky person who happened to graduate into a market where, the job market needed X number of people with this skill, and you're X plus 200. And so it's not necessarily your skills or someone else. It's just basically the luck. You got unlucky. This person got lucky enough to get a job, and I just thought that was such a weird way of phrasing that and looking at that and viewing a guaranteed employment through that lens of like, well, you would lose those things because you were just given a job. And I'm like, there's nothing real magical. I mean, if you talk to anybody who's been unemployed for a long time, there's nothing magical about the employment search that somehow I have been chosen to have this job, so I have these things. And it kind of discounted, I think, the social benefit to a lot of those jobs that are likely to come from a guaranteed employment program, like, doing social good, seeing the results of your work physically if you're doing something like trail maintenance or forest maintaining or preserving forests. There's something you can see in the work that you've done. You know, built something, you can do that. So I thought that was kind of a strange point to make. It's not something they spend a ton of time on, but it actually made me, it to me boistered the argument for guaranteed employment in a way that I didn't think was going to be boistered. Um, you know, obviously the biggest thing is how do you pay for this? They don't spend a ton of time on that, and they basically say, well, we're ecumenical to how it's paid for, and they don't go into really what the marginal tax rates would be in a standard system. I think one of the reasons they advocate for a value added tax because that system is already in place in Europe, and so it would be easy to do. Um, but yeah, it's a very interesting idea. I don't know if I would have started with this book if I'd known what the book was. There's a section where they talk about distribute. I should probably That's probably a good place to end. There's a section where they talk about distributive justice and trying to see if this model would pass the egalitarian test of John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin. Now you may be asking yourself, does it need to? Do we need to have that test? Is John Rawls that much of a gatekeeper? And I think Van Parijs has a kind of a back and forth with Rawls that you look in the footnotes, and the two of them have kind of gone back and forth. And Rawls's idea, for maybe those who don't know, his most famous idea is how does one evaluate what is a just society? And he has a thought experiment. And this is me going through the idea pretty quickly. If you're someone who's a Rawlsian scholar and I get a detail wrong, I apologize. There's an idea called a veil of ignorance, where people choose a society not knowing who they are going to be as a member of that society. And what Rawls believes is they would choose a society in which there's something called the difference principle. So in distributing goods, society would choose to every member in society would choose, not knowing their position before they enter into the society, a system where the most advantaged group, the richest people in society, would be taxed in order to provide for the least advantaged group. And there's things about basic rights in there and a fair equality of opportunity. But the idea is that, at least in Rawls's original position, his original book, Theory of Justice, which is usually what people cite, though he changed this model slightly throughout his life. These are all, when we say the least advantaged group, these are people who are working 40 hours a week. And he really does not like the idea of people receiving benefits without working. And they say in the footnote of this book, Basic Income, that Rawls throughout his life was pretty adamant to that idea, and he was much more open to the idea of a guaranteed employment program than a guaranteed income program. But nonetheless, the two authors of Basic Income try to find, I don't want to say a Rawlsian loophole, but they try to find a way in which, if Rawls also values leisure as part of his fair equality of opportunity, which he kind of demands, then he would also need to make space for this idea. And how successful they are depends on how much you care about that. I didn't care that much about it. They spend some pages talking about that, as well as Dworkin and how Dworkin, as a luck egalitarian, would also probably be hesitant to have a program that has no work attachments to it, and also rewards people who have made bad decisions with their life as well, people who have made prudent decisions. So, and they have another way of situating this theory in that as well. And so your mileage may vary of how much that you wanted that, but that is also in the book. So the book is interesting of what they choose to engage with and what they don't. I was kind of put off by some of the language. It's very dry, it's very Eurocentric, and I didn't need the long history of this idea of the basic income. But I also think it does an adequate job as a reference if I wanted to go back and say, well, why would the authors advocate for a universal basic income as opposed to a guaranteed work program? Or I don't know what they call it, a demogrant, which seems to be similar to John Romer's idea of some kind of each citizen has some kind of, I don't know if it's essentially a baby bond. And I think Romer's idea was something like you have coupons that are tied to the overall production of society that can't be traded. It's very kind of, it was hard for me to follow exactly what Romer was advocating for. And they don't get into Romer's plan as much as the kind of it's basically a baby bond, and they look at why they advocate for a UBI as opposed to a baby bond. So you can read all that if that's interesting to you. The real meat of the book, I think, is kind of in the first section where they talk about why they advocate for it, what it would do, who it would help, and that's in like the first chapter called and it's the instrument of freedom. And then beyond that is where they talk about the alternatives to the UBI. But that really, the first like 30 pages or so, I think is probably the most interesting part of the book, that I would probably recommend um, for most people who are going to pick it up. They get into the whole, like I said, the biggest hurdle you are going to get into politically, even if you were able to fund it, is what to do with freeloaders and how different societies view freeloaders. So these are people who are not working who would use this money to instead have leisure time, and they kind of go through that. They go through a lot of benefits too of it. The program, you then now don't have paperwork to have to prove whether or not you are eligible for this, and they kind of go into how that really enables a lot of people to have freedom in their life. Not necessarily even people who just want to go surfing, but if you're between employment, if you're a student, if you have an illness and you need to leave the workforce, and there's all kinds of benefits to it that they go through that may seem maybe not obvious to everybody at first glance. But I would recommend, if someone was going to pick it up and didn't want to get into everything, that first 30 pages is probably the area I would focus on for someone who doesn't need to get deep into the weeds. And I read it in a couple days. I mean, it's not super hard reading. It's just like there are some sections where they spend a lot more time than I personally needed to get the idea across. This is the last book at this point that Van Parijs has written. I believe he is still with us, but this is 2017, so this is pre-COVID, and so I don't know if COVID has changed his ideas at all about it, if he's more likely or less likely, but just want to note that he also wrote this. He and Yannick both wrote this prior to COVID. Basic income. And next time I'm going to be reading Michael Chabon, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, Pulitzer Prize winner. I've had this on my shelf for a long time, and I think this is probably a good time as any to read it. So I'm looking forward to that. It's supposed to be really good. Until next time, if you've enjoyed this, please feel free to leave a link below. If you've read this book or anything else by Van Parijs, please feel free to leave a comment. I'll have my Twitter link below. And until next time, bye.